I will stay with him. I will stay with him. The words cut through the sterile hospital corridor like a blade through silk. Every nurse, every orderly, every white-coated doctor turned at once. All eyes landed on the voice, quiet but unshaken, utterly unexpected. A black woman stood at the entrance to the private ICU suite. Her cleaning uniform was still damp from mopping the East Wing hallway. A hospital visitor's badge dangled from her collar. She gripped a worn leather purse against her chest, knuckles pale from the pressure. Some nurses exchanged glances. Others pulled out their phones, half recording, half texting. "Who is she?" someone whispered near the nurse's station. "The penthouse cleaner, I think." "Oh, what's next? The janitor prescribing medication?" Laughter rippled softly through the hall, but Naomi Carter didn't flinch. At 42 years old, she had seen her share of condescension. But never had she felt the sting more sharply than in this moment, standing in front of the medical and legal elite of Manhattan, in a hallway built to keep women like her invisible. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's get to the story. The attending physician blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Excuse me, ma'am?" "Naomi Carter," she said clearly. "I want to stay with Mr. Elliot Vanguard as his primary caregiver." The name was enough to stir murmurs again. Elliot Vanguard, tech billionaire, visionary founder of Vanguard Systems, now reduced to a body on life support after a catastrophic stroke during a closed-door investor summit. His legal team had just submitted family withdrawal papers, literally. His wife, after months of marriage, had signed a non-liability release that very morning. His sons had already boarded a private jet to Monaco. Elliot, barely conscious in the bed behind glass walls, lay alone. No family. No advocates. No one. The doctor glanced at his clipboard, then back at Naomi. "Ma'am, only immediate family members are allowed extended ICU access under hospital policy." "He doesn't have any here," Naomi said softly. "But he's not alone. Not while I'm breathing." A sharp voice cut in from behind. A woman in an expensive charcoal suit stepped forward, heels clicking against the polished floor. She was one of the Vanguard family attorneys, Lauren Hastings, tall, blonde, and armed with a briefcase full of legal precedents. "This is highly irregular and frankly inappropriate," she said coolly. "Miss Carter has no legal standing, no medical authority, and no family ties to Mr. Vanguard. I object to this disruption." The doctor hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "She does have a point, Miss Carter. Without legal documentation or family consent." "I have documentation," Naomi said. She opened her purse and pulled out a folded, slightly creased document. It was signed, notarized, and dated 8 months prior. "Mr. Vanguard named me as an emergency caregiver in the event of incapacitation. He filed it with his estate attorney last May." The hallway went silent. Lauren's polished smile faltered. She stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "Let me see that." Naomi handed it over calmly. Lauren scanned it, her jaw tightening with every line. The doctor leaned in, reading over her shoulder. "It's legitimate," he muttered. "Signed by Vanguard, witnessed, and notarized by a licensed New York attorney." Lauren's lips pressed into a thin line. "This is absurd. She's a domestic worker. She has no medical training, no capacity to make complex care decisions. I was a certified nursing assistant before I became a housekeeper," Naomi said evenly. "I left the field to care for my mother during her cancer treatment. I've been CPR certified for 15 years. I understand patient advocacy law, medical consent protocols, and advanced directives." The doctor blinked. Even Lauren seemed momentarily thrown. Naomi took a breath and continued, her voice growing firmer. "I've worked in Mr. Vanguard's home for 9 years. I know his routines, his preferences, his allergies, and his medical history better than anyone currently in this building. And I know he didn't want to be left like this." A junior nurse near the back whispered, "She's got receipts." Someone stifled a laugh. Lauren's expression hardened. "Even if this document holds up, it doesn't give her authority to interfere with family decisions or medical assessments already underway." "Then let the court decide," Naomi said. "But until they do, I'm not leaving his side." The doctor looked between them, clearly out of his depth. Finally he nodded slowly. "Given the documentation and the absence of contesting family members on site, I'll allow Miss Carter supervised access pending legal review." Lauren's eyes flashed. "You'll be hearing from our firm." "I expect I will," Naomi said quietly. She walked past the lawyer, past the nurses, past the whispers and the stares. She pushed open the glass door to Elliot Vanguard's room and stepped inside. The machines hummed softly. Monitors beeped in steady rhythm. Elliot's face was pale, half slack from the stroke, his breathing shallow. Naomi pulled a chair close to his bedside and sat down, just as she had done every evening for nearly a decade when she tidied his penthouse study. She reached out and gently placed her hand over his. "You're not alone, Mr. Vanguard," she whispered. "Not while I'm here." Outside the glass, Lauren Hastings stood with her phone pressed to her ear, already calling reinforcements. The nurses exchanged uneasy glances. The doctor made a note in the chart and walked away, shaking his head. But Naomi didn't notice any of it. She had spent the last 9 years watching, listening, and learning. She had seen the cracks in the Vanguard family long before the stroke. She had studied patient rights during her mother's final months, never imagining she'd need that knowledge again. Now, sitting beside a man the world had already written off, Naomi Carter prepared for the fight of her life. Because staying wasn't just an act of kindness. It was an act of defiance. And she had no intention of backing down. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's get to the story. Naomi hadn't always cleaned luxury penthouses. Once she had worn scrubs instead of aprons. Once she had charted vitals and administered medication in a busy Brooklyn nursing home, working double shifts to put herself through community college. She had dreamed of becoming a registered nurse, maybe even a nurse practitioner someday. But life had other plans. In 2015, her mother was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. The treatments were brutal, expensive, and endless. Naomi left her nursing assistant job to become a full-time caregiver, burning through her savings in 6 months. When her mother passed a year later, Naomi was left with $40,000 in medical debt and no career to return to. That's when she found the listing for a live-in housekeeper position at a private Manhattan penthouse. The pay was good. The hours were predictable. And most importantly, it came with health insurance she desperately needed. She took the job. And for 9 years she cleaned Elliot Vanguard's home, prepared his meals, and stayed out of sight. To the Vanguard family she was furniture. Invisible. Replaceable. Unimportant. But invisible people hear everything. And Naomi had been listening for a very long time. The first thing Naomi learned in her CNA training was simple but profound. Listen to what the patient isn't saying. Watch their eyes. Notice the small movements. The tremor in a hand. The way they turn toward a voice or away from it. Her instructor, a 60-year-old Haitian woman named Mrs. Laurent, had drilled it into every student. "Medicine treats the body," she would say, tapping her chest. "But care? Care requires you to see the whole person. And most people? They don't want to be seen. They want to be comfortable." Naomi had carried that lesson with her through every shift at the nursing home, through every late night with her mother, and eventually into the pristine marble halls of Elliot Vanguard's penthouse. She had thought those skills would fade, buried under years of dusting bookshelves and folding linens. But skills like that don't disappear. They sharpen with disuse, waiting for the moment they're needed again. And now, sitting beside Elliot's hospital bed in the dim glow of medical monitors, Naomi felt every instinct she'd ever honed come roaring back to life. The penthouse had been a fortress of silence. 18,000 square feet overlooking Central Park, floor-to-ceiling windows, imported Italian furniture, and a family that barely spoke to one another. Naomi had arrived in 2016, nervous and grieving, still carrying the weight of her mother's death like a stone in her chest. Elliot Vanguard had been different then. Sure. Commanding. The kind of man who could walk into a room and shift the entire atmosphere with a single glance. He worked 18-hour days, took calls at 3 in the morning, and rarely ate unless Naomi placed food directly in front of him. But even then she had noticed the cracks. His wife, Victoria, spent more time at their summer home in the Hamptons than in the penthouse. Their sons, Julian and Marcus, visited only when they needed money or signatures. Family dinners were rare, tense, and transactional. Naomi had learned to move through the penthouse like a ghost. She never interrupted phone calls. Never asked questions. Never made eye contact unless absolutely necessary. Invisible. That was the role. That was survival. But invisibility had its advantages. People said things around her they would never say to each other. Victoria, on the phone with her sister, complaining about Elliot's obsession with work and his inability to prioritize family. Julian, pacing the living room, arguing with his brother about stock options and board votes. Marcus, drunk on expensive scotch, muttering about how their father built an empire but forgot to build a family. Naomi had heard it all. And she had stayed silent. Because that was the job. That was the deal. She cleaned. She cooked. She existed in the margins. And in return she had stability. Health insurance. A paycheck that kept the debt collectors at bay. But watching Elliot now, his face slack and pale, his breathing assisted by machines, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had witnessed over the past 9 years had been building to this moment. The abandonment hadn't started with the stroke. It had started years ago, slowly, quietly, until the only thing holding the Vanguard family together was money. And now that Elliot's grip on that money was slipping, so was their pretense of loyalty. The first red flag came on the second day. A neurologist arrived for what was supposed to be a comprehensive cognitive assessment. Naomi had assisted with similar evaluations during her time as a CNA. They were thorough, methodical, often lasting over an hour. This one took 12 minutes. The doctor asked Elliot 3 questions, barely waited for responses, and scribbled notes onto a tablet without making eye contact. When Naomi politely asked about the timeline for rehabilitation, the doctor waved her off. "We'll see," he muttered. "Prognosis is unclear." Naomi's stomach tightened. Unclear wasn't a medical term. It was a dodge. The next morning, a different doctor appeared. This one didn't introduce himself. He performed a reflex test, checked Elliot's pupils and left without a word. Then came the lawyers. 2 of them, both from the same firm representing Victoria and the Sons. They arrived with clipboards and tablets, speaking in low voices to the attending physician. Naomi caught fragments. Competency hearing. Temporary conservatorship. Financial protection. She stood outside the glass door, watching them hover over Elliot like vultures circling wounded prey. He was awake, barely, his eyes half open and unfocused. They didn't ask him questions. They asked the doctor questions about him. Can he understand complex information? Can he make informed decisions? Is there any indication of cognitive recovery? The doctor hesitated on each answer, his responses careful, non-committal. But Naomi noticed something the lawyers didn't. Every time they said Elliot's name, his eyes shifted. Just slightly. Toward the sound. Toward them. He was listening. He understood more than they thought. And they were counting on no one noticing. That evening, after the lawyers left and the nurses changed shifts, Naomi sat beside Elliot in the quiet dimness. She didn't speak at first. She just watched the steady rise and fall of his chest, the blinking monitors, the 4-drip feeding medication into his veins. Then, softly she began to talk. Not to fill the silence but to test a theory. "Mr. Vanguard," she said gently. "If you can hear me, I need you to try something. Blink twice." Nothing. His eyes stayed half closed, unfocused. Naomi waited. Counted to 10. Tried again. "If you can hear me, blink twice." This time, slowly, painfully, his eyelids fluttered. "What? Twice?" Naomi's breath caught. She leaned closer. "You're still in there?" she whispered. "I knew it." She reached for his hand, the one that hadn't been affected by the stroke. His fingers were cold, limp. But when she placed her palm against his, she felt the faintest pressure. A squeeze. Weak but deliberate. Tears pricked Naomi's eyes. She blinked them back. "They think you're gone," she said softly. "They're already making plans. But I won't let them do this to you. I promise." Elliot's mouth trembled. His lips parted, struggling to form words. The sound that came out was garbled, broken, barely audible. But Naomi heard it. She leaned in, her ear close to his mouth. Julian. The name came out in fragments, slurred and desperate. Naomi's chest tightened. "Your son? Julian?" Elliot's eyes widened just slightly. His hand squeezed hers again, harder this time. "What about Julian?" Naomi asked urgently. "Is he involved in this? Does he?" But Elliot's strength gave out. His hand went limp. His eyes closed. The machines beeped steadily, unchanged, but Naomi knew. He had used every ounce of energy he had to say that name. She sat back, her mind racing. Julian Vanguard, the eldest son. The heir apparent. The one who had argued most loudly about protecting the family's assets. The one who had left for Monaco hours after his father collapsed. Naomi thought back to the overheard conversations in the penthouse. Julian on the phone, voice low and urgent, talking about timeline and board votes. Julian pacing the study, rifling through his father's desk when he thought no one was watching. Julian, always Julian, positioning himself as the future of Vanguard systems. And now his father, barely able to speak, was using his last shred of clarity to warn someone. To warn her. Naomi stood, her jaw set. She walked to the small table near the window where she'd left her purse. Inside was her phone, a notepad, and the folded caregiver document that had gotten her into this room. She pulled out the notepad and began writing. Names, dates, observations, the rushed medical evaluations, the lawyer's questions, the timeline of family visits or lack thereof. Julian's name circled twice. This wasn't grief. This wasn't a family struggling to cope with tragedy. This was something else. Something planned. Something cold. Naomi returned to Elliot's bedside and sat down. She took his hand again, holding it gently. I don't know what they're planning, she said quietly. But I know you didn't survive building an empire just to have it stolen while you're still breathing. The monitors beeped. The machines hummed. Outside the glass, nurses walked past, barely glancing in. To them, this was just another ICU room. Another patient. Another family drama they'd seen 100 times before. But to Naomi, this was a line in the sand. She had spent 9 years being invisible, being silent, being exactly what everyone expected her to be. She had accepted that role because she needed it. Because survival required compromise. Not anymore. Staying in this room wasn't just an act of kindness. It wasn't just honoring a document Elliot had signed months ago, perhaps knowing this day might come. It was resistance. It was protection. It was the only thing standing between a broken man and the people who wanted him erased. Naomi leaned close, her voice barely a whisper, but her words carried the weight of an unbreakable vow. I won't let them erase you, Mr. Vanguard. I promise you that. Whatever it takes, however long it takes. I won't let them win. Elliot's breathing remained steady. His eyes stayed closed. But somewhere deep in the stillness, Naomi felt something shift. A connection. An understanding. A silent pact between two people the world had underestimated. And tomorrow, when the lawyers returned with their documents and their cold efficiency, they would find Naomi Carter still sitting in that chair. Still watching. Still listening. Still refusing to disappear. Because invisible people hear everything. And now, finally, Naomi was ready to speak. The lawyer arrived at exactly 9 o'clock on the third morning, flanked by hospital security and carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than Naomi made in 6 months. His name was Richard Holloway, senior partner at Hastings & Crane, the firm that had represented the Vanguard family for over 2 decades. He was tall, silver-haired, with the kind of tan that came from weekend sailing trips and winter vacations in St. Bart's. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, and his cufflinks caught the fluorescent light as he pushed open the door to Elliot's room without knocking. Naomi looked up from her chair beside the bed. She had been reading the morning paper aloud, her voice low and steady, the way she had done every morning since she'd been allowed to stay. Elliot's eyes were closed, but his breathing had changed slightly when she started reading the business section. Small signs. But signs nonetheless. Miss Carter, Holloway said, not bothering with pleasantries. I need you to step outside. His tone carried the expectation of immediate compliance, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Naomi carefully folded the newspaper and set it on the side table. I'm staying with Mr. Vanguard, she said calmly. He asked me to be here. Holloway's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. Mr. Vanguard is not currently in a position to make requests. The family has decided that your presence is no longer appropriate or necessary. The family isn't here, Naomi replied. She remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, her voice even. They haven't been here since the day he collapsed. I have legal documentation granting me caregiver status, and I intend to honor it. One of the security guards shifted uncomfortably. The other stared straight ahead, stone-faced. Holloway stepped closer, his briefcase hitting the floor with a deliberate thud. He pulled out a folder, thick with papers, and opened it with practiced efficiency. This documentation, he said, holding up a copy of the caregiver agreement Naomi had presented days earlier, was signed under circumstances that are now being reviewed for validity. Mr. Vanguard's mental state at the time of signing is in question, particularly given his recent cognitive decline. He signed it 8 months ago, Naomi said. Long before the stroke. He was completely lucid. The document was witnessed and notarized by a licensed attorney. An attorney who is no longer with the firm that currently represents Mr. Vanguard's interests, Holloway countered smoothly. And given that Mr. Vanguard is now legally incompetent to make medical or financial decisions, this agreement is functionally void. Naomi felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her expression neutral. He hasn't been declared incompetent. Not officially. Not by a court. Holloway smiled, thin and cold. That's a matter of paperwork and time, Miss Carter. Both of which are already in motion. Now, I'm going to ask you one more time, politely, To step outside so that Mr. Vanguard's actual family can make arrangements for his care. No, Naomi said. The word hung in the air, simple and immovable. The security guards exchanged glances. Holloway's jaw tightened, the first crack in his polished veneer. Miss Carter, I don't think you understand the position you're putting yourself in, he said, his voice dropping to something quieter but far more dangerous. You are an employee. You have no legal standing, no family relationship, and no authority here. If you continue to interfere, I will have you removed and banned from this facility. Naomi stood slowly, meeting his gaze. Then you'll have to do that. But until a judge tells me otherwise, I'm not leaving. She glanced at the security guards. And I don't think these gentlemen want to be part of forcibly removing a woman from a dying man's bedside. Not when there are cameras in every hallway and nurses watching from every station. Holloway's eyes flashed. He leaned in, lowering his voice so only Naomi could hear. You're playing a game you can't win. Walk away now and this ends quietly. Keep pushing and I promise you we will bury you. Naomi didn't flinch. I've been buried before, Mr. Holloway. I dug myself out. I can do it again. For a long moment they stood there, locked in silent confrontation. Then Holloway stepped back, his expression smoothing into professional detachment once more. Fine, he said. Have it your way. But there's something you should know. The family has requested that Mr. Vanguard's personal effects be collected from his penthouse residence. Since you're so insistent on being involved, perhaps you'd like to handle that task. Save us the trouble of hiring movers. Naomi's stomach tightened. She knew a trap when she heard one. But she also knew that whatever was happening at the penthouse, she needed to see it. When? She asked. Today, Holloway said. The building manager is expecting you at 2 o'clock. You have access codes, I assume. He snapped his briefcase shut. Collect his clothing, personal items, anything he might need for an extended care facility. The family will handle the rest. Extended care facility. Not rehabilitation. Not recovery. A place where people went to wait. Naomi's jaw tightened, but she nodded. I'll go. Good, Holloway said. He glanced at Elliot's still form, his expression unreadable. Enjoy your last few hours of relevance, Miss Carter. They won't last long. He turned and walked out, the security guards trailing behind him. The door swung shut with a soft hiss, leaving Naomi alone with Elliot and the steady rhythm of machines. She sat back down, her hands shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against her thighs, forcing herself to breathe. I have to go to the penthouse, she said softly, more to herself than to Elliot. But I'll be back. I promise. Elliot's eyes remained closed. But his hand, resting on the blanket, twitched. Just once. Naomi reached over and squeezed it gently. Then she stood, grabbed her coat and headed for the door. The penthouse felt wrong the moment Naomi stepped inside. She had her key, the one Elliot had given her years ago, and the building manager had nodded her through without comment. But as the elevator doors opened onto the private foyer, she felt the absence immediately. The air was different. Still. The usual hum of climate control seemed louder, echoing in the emptiness. Naomi walked slowly through the entryway, her footsteps muffled by thick carpet. The living room stretched out before her, floor-to-ceiling windows framing a gray January sky. But the room itself was wrong. Furniture had been moved. Elliot's favorite reading chair, the leather one he'd sat in every evening with a glass of whiskey and the Wall Street Journal, was gone. The bookshelves, once packed with first editions and business memoirs, were half empty. Boxes were stacked near the fireplace, labeled in neat block letters. Donations. Storage. Estate sale. Naomi's chest tightened. They were erasing him. Not after he died. No. While he was still breathing. She moved quickly through the penthouse, room by room. The master bedroom had been stripped. The closet, once filled with custom suits and Italian shoes, was nearly bare. The bathroom counters were empty. Even the small framed photograph of Elliot with his sons, taken years ago at some corporate event, had been removed from the nightstand. Naomi found herself standing in Elliot's study, the one room she had always cleaned last because he spent so much time there. The massive oak desk still dominated the space, but the drawers were open, some completely empty. Papers were scattered across the surface, and a paper shredder sat in the corner, its bin overflowing with thin strips of white and cream-colored paper. Naomi knelt beside the shredder and carefully pulled out a handful of strips. She laid them on the floor, trying to piece them together like a puzzle. Most were beyond recovery, too finely shredded. But a few larger pieces had survived. She saw fragments of legal language. Revocable trust. Amendment to estate. Naomi Carter, designated. Her breath caught. She dug deeper, pulling out more strips, her hands trembling now. Another fragment. Full medical authority. And another. Julian Vanguard, removed as primary. Someone had shredded Elliot's estate documents. Not old ones. Recent ones. Naomi stood, her mind racing. She crossed to the desk and rifled through the remaining papers. Most were standard business correspondence, old contracts, notes about board meetings. But tucked beneath a stack of folders, she found a draft document, freshly printed, still warm from the laser printer in the corner. It was titled, Petition for Emergency Conservatorship and Declaration of Incompetence. Naomi scanned the pages, her heart pounding. The petition requested that Elliot Vanguard be declared permanently unable to manage his own affairs due to severe and irreversible cognitive impairment. It named Julian Vanguard as conservator, granting him full control over Elliot's medical decisions, financial assets, and corporate voting rights. The petition was dated 3 days after Elliot's stroke. 3 days. Before any long-term prognosis could possibly be determined. Before rehabilitation had even been attempted. The medical evaluations attached to the petition were signed by doctors Naomi had never seen before. Doctors who had never examined Elliot in her presence. This wasn't a family trying to protect their father. This was a hostile takeover. A carefully orchestrated plan to seize control while Elliot was too weak to fight back. And the stroke hadn't caused it. The stroke had simply accelerated it. Naomi took photos of every page with her phone, her hands shaking so badly she had to steady them against the desk. She was about to leave when she noticed something else. A new document, printed on heavier stock, sitting in the printer tray. It was a revised trust. Dated yesterday. It transferred Vanguard Systems controlling shares to a family holding company managed exclusively by Julian and Marcus. Elliot's name appeared nowhere in the management structure. He had been erased from his own empire. Naomi photographed that too. Then she carefully placed everything back exactly as she had found it. She grabbed a small bag from the closet and filled it with a few of Elliot's personal items, clothing, a watch, things that would justify her trip. But her mind was screaming. They weren't waiting for Elliot to die. They were burying him alive. As she walked toward the elevator, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, expecting a call from the hospital. Instead, it was a text from an unknown number. No name. No area code she recognized. Just 5 words, "You're in over your head." Naomi froze. She looked around the empty penthouse, suddenly aware of how alone she was. How vulnerable. Another buzz. Another message, "Walk away while you still can." Her pulse hammered in her ears. She stepped into the elevator and jabbed the button for the lobby. The doors slid shut. As the elevator descended, she stared at her phone, at those threatening words glowing on the screen. Someone was watching her. Someone knew she had been to the penthouse. Someone knew what she had found. And they wanted her gone. The elevator doors opened. Naomi stepped out into the marble lobby, forcing herself to walk normally, casually, like nothing was wrong. The doorman nodded as she passed. She smiled back, her face a mask of calm. But inside, every instinct she had was screaming. By the time she reached the street, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a photo. A picture of her, taken from across the street, standing in front of the building. Taken moments ago. The message that followed was simple: "We're always watching." Naomi's hands went cold. She shoved her phone into her pocket and hailed a cab, looking over her shoulder, scanning the crowd. She didn't see anyone obviously following her. But that didn't mean they weren't there. As the cab pulled away from the curb, heading back toward the hospital, Naomi sat in the back seat, her mind racing through everything she had seen. The shredded documents. The forged evaluations. The conservatorship petition. The threats. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't a family struggling with a tragedy. This was a plan. A calculated, deliberate plan to erase Elliot Vanguard while he was still alive, to seize his empire, and to silence anyone who stood in the way. And Naomi Carter, a woman the world had spent 9 years ignoring, had just become the only obstacle left. She pulled out her phone again, staring at the threatening messages. Then she opened her photo gallery and looked at the images she had taken of the legal documents. Evidence. She had evidence. And as long as she had that, she had power. But she also had a target on her back. Naomi leaned forward and told the driver to hurry. She needed to get back to Elliot's room. She needed to make copies of everything she had found. She needed to move fast. Because whoever was behind this had already shown they were willing to destroy everything Elliot had built. And if they were willing to do that, Naomi had no illusions about what they might be willing to do to her. The cab wove through midtown traffic and Naomi watched the city blur past the window. Somewhere in this city, powerful people were making decisions about Elliot's fate. Decisions that would determine whether he lived as a prisoner in his own body or whether he had a chance to fight back. And Naomi had just decided which side of that fight she was on. She wasn't walking away. Not now. Not ever. Even if it cost her everything. Naomi made it back to the hospital by 4:30 in the afternoon. She walked through the main entrance with her bag of Elliot's belongings, nodded to the receptionist, and took the elevator to the ICU floor. Her phone sat heavy in her pocket, the threatening messages still glowing in her mind like neon warnings. But she had something they didn't know about. Evidence. Photographs. Proof. And she had spent the entire cab ride remembering everything she had learned during her mother's final year, every patient rights seminar she had attended, every advocacy workshop she had sat through while other families slept or gave up. New York State had some of the strongest patient protection laws in the country. She knew that. She had used them before to challenge rushed discharge orders and questionable DNR recommendations. She knew the language, the loopholes, the leverage points. And now, walking back into Elliot's room, she realized she was about to need every single one of them. The room was empty when she arrived. Elliot lay exactly as she had left him, the machines humming their steady rhythm. Naomi set the bag down, pulled out her phone, and began uploading the photos she had taken to a secure cloud account. Then she emailed copies to herself at 3 different addresses. Finally, she printed hard copies using the printer at the nurse's station, claiming she needed to review medical consent forms. The nurse on duty barely looked up. "Just bring them back when you're done." Naomi nodded and took the stack of papers back to Elliot's room. She spread them out on the small table near the window, organizing them into categories. Shredded trust fragments. Conservatorship petition. Forged medical evaluations. Revised estate documents. It was a paper trail of betrayal. And it was about to become her armor. She was still organizing when she heard voices in the hallway. Loud, authoritative, moving closer. Naomi's pulse quickened. She quickly gathered the documents and slid them into a folder, tucking it into her bag just as the door swung open. Richard Holloway entered first, his expression harder than it had been that morning. Behind him came 2 hospital security officers, both looking uncomfortable. And behind them, moving with slow, deliberate authority, came Victoria Vanguard. Elliot's wife was 52 years old, blonde, meticulously maintained, and dressed in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Naomi's entire wardrobe. She wore pearls at her throat and carried a designer handbag that matched her heels. Her face was composed, blank, the kind of neutrality that came from years of practice hiding emotion. She looked at Naomi the way someone might look at a stain on expensive furniture. With mild distaste and the expectation that it would be removed shortly. "Miss Carter," Holloway said. "Mrs. Vanguard has requested that you leave the premises immediately. Your services are no longer required." Naomi stood, keeping her voice calm. "I'm not an employee anymore, Mr. Holloway. I'm Mr. Vanguard's designated caregiver. And I'm not leaving." Victoria spoke for the first time, her voice cool and precise. "You are a housekeeper who has overstayed her purpose. My husband is incapacitated. He cannot make decisions about his care. That responsibility falls to his family." She gestured vaguely toward Elliot's still form. "This charade has gone on long enough." "It's not a charade," Naomi said. She reached into her bag and pulled out the folder. "Your husband signed legal documents 8 months ago granting me medical advocacy rights in the event of his incapacitation. Those documents are valid, witnessed, and filed with his estate attorney." "An attorney who no longer represents this family," Holloway interjected smoothly. "And documents that were signed under questionable circumstances." Naomi met his gaze. What's questionable about a man making provisions for his own care? He was lucid. He was thorough. And he clearly didn't trust his family to act in his best interests. Victoria's expression flickered, just for a moment. Anger maybe. Or shame. It passed quickly. "Remove her," she said to the security officers. "Now." The officers stepped forward, but Naomi held her ground. Under New York Public Health Law Article 29C, a designated healthcare agent has the legal authority to make medical decisions on behalf of an incapacitated patient unless a court rules otherwise. You don't have a court order. You have paperwork and intimidation. One of the security officers hesitated. The other looked at Holloway. "Is that true?" he asked. Holloway's jaw tightened. "The legal status of her documentation is under review. Under review isn't the same as invalidated, Naomi said. She pulled out another sheet from her folder. I also have evidence that Mr. Vanguard's competency evaluations were conducted improperly, potentially fraudulently, and without following standard neurological assessment protocols. The room went silent. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Holloway took a step closer. That's a serious accusation, Miss Carter. One you cannot possibly substantiate. Naomi pulled out the printed photos of the conservatorship petition. The evaluations attached to your petition for emergency conservatorship were signed by doctors who never examined Mr. Vanguard in the presence of any witness. They were completed in under 15 minutes each. The standard for a comprehensive neurological evaluation is a minimum of 45 minutes, often longer. She laid the papers on the table. I also have documentation showing that these evaluations occurred within 72 hours of Mr. Vanguard's stroke, a period during which most neurologists refuse to make long-term prognosis determinations because the brain is still in acute recovery. Holloway's expression went cold. Where did you get those documents? Naomi didn't blink. That's not relevant. What's relevant is that they exist. And if you try to remove me by force, I will file a formal complaint with the New York State Department of Health alleging medical malpractice, elder abuse, and fraudulent conservatorship proceedings. Victoria's composure cracked. You're a domestic worker with delusions of relevance. You have no legal training, no standing, and no right to interfere with family matters. Naomi turned to her, her voice quieter but no less firm. I have patient advocacy training. I have documentation. And I have a voice. That's more than Mr. Vanguard has right now. So yes, I'm going to use it. The tension in the room was suffocating. The security officers looked at each other, clearly out of their depth. Holloway's hand twitched toward his briefcase, but he didn't move. Finally he spoke, his voice tight with controlled fury. This isn't over. I know, Naomi said. But it's not ending here either. Holloway turned to Victoria. We need to regroup. Handle this properly. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced at Elliot's motionless form, her expression unreadable. Then she looked back at Naomi. You'll regret this, she said softly. When this is over and you've lost everything you think you're fighting for, you'll understand how foolish you've been. She turned and walked out, heels clicking sharply against the floor. Holloway followed, and the security officers trailed behind, leaving Naomi alone again. Her hands were shaking. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself, breathing hard. She had just declared war on one of the wealthiest families in New York. And she had done it with nothing but paperwork and stubbornness. But the war wasn't over. It had just begun. 20 minutes later, a nurse knocked softly and entered. Miss Carter? There's a, family meeting scheduled in conference room B. You've been requested to attend. Naomi's stomach dropped. Requested by whom? The Vanguard family attorney, the nurse said. She looked sympathetic. I'm sorry. I think they're trying to settle this. Naomi nodded. I'll be there. She glanced at Elliot, still unconscious, still fighting battles he didn't even know were happening. Then she grabbed her folder and followed the nurse down the hallway. Conference room B was small, windowless, and dominated by a long table. Victoria sat at one end, flanked by her two sons. Julian Vanguard was 34, tall and sharply dressed, with his father's eyes but none of his warmth. Marcus, 2 years younger, looked bored and irritated, scrolling through his phone. Holloway sat across from them, another lawyer beside him. A hospital administrator sat at the far end, looking like she wanted to be anywhere else. Naomi entered and took the only empty chair, directly across from Julian. He looked at her with open contempt. So you're the maid who thinks she's a lawyer. Naomi met his gaze. I'm the person your father trusted when he realized his family couldn't be. Julian's expression darkened. My father is a vegetable. He's not coming back. And you playing nurse isn't going to change that. Naomi felt anger flare in her chest, but she kept her voice level. Your father is recovering from a stroke. Recovery takes time. But you've already written him off because it's convenient for you. Convenient? Marcus looked up from his phone. Do you have any idea what it's like watching someone you love waste away? Naomi leaned forward. Yes, I do. I watched my mother die of cancer. I sat beside her for a year while she fought. And I didn't abandon her the moment she stopped being useful. The room went silent. Victoria's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. Naomi pressed on. The medical evaluations you're using to declare him incompetent are flawed. They were rushed, incomplete, and potentially falsified. I'm formally requesting an independent neurological review by a board-certified specialist with no ties to your family or your legal team. Holloway shook his head. That's not how this works, Miss Carter. The family has the right to choose their father's medical providers. Not if those providers are issuing fraudulent assessments, Naomi said. She opened her folder and slid copies of the documents across the table. These evaluations don't meet the standard of care. Any ethical review board will see that. Julian snatched up the papers, scanning them quickly. His jaw tightened. How did you get these? Naomi didn't answer. Holloway leaned forward. Miss Carter, if you obtained these documents illegally? I obtained them from publicly filed court documents attached to your conservatorship petition, Naomi said smoothly. It was a lie but a plausible one. They're part of the legal record. The hospital administrator cleared her throat. If there are concerns about the validity of the medical assessments, hospital policy does allow for independent review in contested cases. Julian slammed his hand on the table. This is ridiculous. She has no authority. No standing. She's a goddamn housekeeper. Naomi stood. Then let's settle this right now. She walked to the door, opened it and called out. Can someone bring Mr. Vanguard to the conference room? He should be part of this conversation. Holloway stood quickly. Absolutely not. He's in no condition. He's conscious, Naomi said. He responds to stimuli. And he has the right to be present for decisions about his own life. 10 minutes later, 2 nurses wheeled Elliot into the room. He was propped up slightly, his eyes half open, his face pale and slack. The family stared at him like he was already a corpse. Naomi walked over and knelt beside the wheelchair. Mr. Vanguard, she said gently. Can you hear me? His eyes shifted slowly toward her voice. Naomi took his hand, the one that still had some function. I need to ask you something important. Do you trust me to make decisions about your care? The room held its breath. Elliot's mouth trembled. His hand, weak and shaking, squeezed hers. What? Twice? 3 times. Naomi looked up at the family. That's a yes. Julian stood. That's not consent. That's a reflex. Naomi turned to the hospital administrator. Get a neurologist in here. Right now. Let's have him evaluated properly in front of witnesses, with no one coaching the results. The administrator hesitated, then nodded. I'll make the call. As she left the room, Victoria stood, her composure finally cracking. You're destroying this family. You're tearing apart everything we've built. Naomi met her gaze. No, Mrs. Vanguard. You already did that. I'm just making sure the world sees it. Victoria's face went white. She turned and walked out without another word. Marcus followed, still scrolling his phone. Julian remained, staring at Naomi with barely concealed rage. You have no idea what you've just done, he said quietly. Naomi looked down at Elliot, still holding his hand. I've given your father a fighting chance. That's more than you were willing to do. Julian turned and left, slamming the door behind him. The room emptied slowly until only Naomi and Elliot remained. She knelt beside him again, exhausted, shaking, but resolute. I won't let them erase you, she whispered. I promise. And for the first time since the stroke, Naomi saw something in Elliot's eyes that looked almost like hope. The independent neurologist arrived the next morning at 8 o'clock sharp. His name was Dr. Samuel Chin, a board-certified specialist from Mount Sinai with over 20 years of experience in stroke rehabilitation and cognitive assessment. He carried no briefcase full of pre-written conclusions, no loyalty to the Vanguard family, and no patience for anything less than clinical precision. Naomi had spent the night in Elliot's room, sleeping in the uncomfortable vinyl chair, waking every hour to the sounds of monitors and nurse rotations. She had barely closed her eyes, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios, escape plans, and the creeping fear that she had pushed too far, too fast. But when Dr. Chin walked in, flanked by the hospital administrator and a medical ethics observer, Naomi felt something shift. Validation. Process. The machinery of actual medicine, not corporate maneuvering. Dr. Chin nodded to her politely. Miss Carter, I understand you raised concerns about previous evaluations? Yes, Naomi said, standing and smoothing her wrinkled shirt. The assessments were completed in under 15 minutes each, with no standardized cognitive testing, and were signed by physicians who never examined Mr. Vanguard in the presence of witnesses. Dr. Chin made a note on his tablet. I'll be conducting a full evaluation. This will take approximately 90 minutes. I'll need the room cleared except for essential medical staff. Naomi nodded and stepped toward the door, but Dr. Chin held up a hand. You can stay, Miss Carter. As the designated healthcare agent, you have the right to observe. She glanced at the administrator, who nodded reluctantly. Naomi sat back down, her heart pounding. For the next hour and a half, Dr. Chin worked methodically. He tested Elliot's reflexes, his pupil responses, his ability to track movement with his eyes. He asked questions simple at first, then progressively more complex. He used standardized cognitive tests, visual cues, and motor function assessments. Elliot struggled. His speech was slurred, fragmented. His right side remained weak. But he responded. Slowly, painfully, but consistently. When Dr. Chin asked him to squeeze his left hand twice for yes, Elliot did. When asked to blink once for no, he complied. Mr. Vanguard, Dr. Chin said clearly, leaning into Elliot's line of sight. Do you understand that you suffered a stroke? 2 squeezes. Yes. Do you understand that decisions are being made about your medical care? 2 squeezes. Yes. Do you trust Miss Carter to advocate for you? Elliot's eyes shifted to Naomi. For a long moment he just looked at her. Then, with effort that made Naomi's chest tighten, he squeezed her hand 3 times. Emphatic. Unmistakable. Dr. Chin made another note. Mr. Vanguard demonstrates consistent, goal-directed responses. His cognitive impairment is significant but not total. He retains decision-making capacity in key areas, particularly regarding his own care preferences. The administrator's pen froze mid-stroke. Naomi felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. Dr. Chin continued his assessment, testing memory, recognition, and comprehension. By the time he finished, his conclusion was clear. This patient is not vegetative, not incompetent, and certainly not beyond recovery. Declaring him legally incompetent at this stage would be premature and medically inappropriate. He looked at the administrator. I'll be filing my report with the Hospital Ethics Board and submitting a copy to the court handling the conservatorship petition. I'll also be recommending an investigation into the previous evaluations. The administrator nodded, her expression grim. I'll notify the legal department. As Dr. Chin left, Naomi exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. She looked down at Elliot, who was staring at her with an intensity she hadn't seen since before the stroke. We're not done yet, she whispered. But we're getting there. By noon, the fallout had begun. The hospital's legal department requested copies of all medical evaluations related to Elliot Vanguard's case. The ethics board opened a formal inquiry into the competency assessments. And someone, whether the hospital or Dr. Chin himself, leaked the story to the press. By 2 o'clock, news vans were parked outside the hospital. By 3, the headline was trending online. Billionaire's family accused of fraudulent incompetency claim. Naomi watched the coverage on her phone, her stomach churning. She had wanted accountability, not a media circus. But the story had momentum now, and there was no stopping it. The business press picked it up first. Then the legal blogs. Then the mainstream outlets, hungry for a story about wealth, betrayal, and corporate intrigue. And at the center of it all was a name no one had expected. Naomi Carter. The housekeeper who refused to disappear. By 4 o'clock, Richard Holloway was back at the hospital, his face red, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. He didn't come to Elliot's room. He went straight to the administration offices, flanked by 2 additional lawyers and a public relations consultant. Naomi heard about it from a nurse who had overheard the shouting. They're threatening lawsuits, the nurse whispered. Against the hospital, against Dr. Chin, against you. Naomi's pulse quickened. On what grounds? Defamation. Interference. Breach of privacy. They're throwing everything at the wall. Naomi nodded slowly. She had expected this. Powerful people didn't surrender quietly. They fought dirty, leveraged every resource, turned victims into villains. But this time the evidence wasn't on their side. That evening, the board of Vanguard Systems called an emergency meeting. Naomi learned about it from a business news alert on her phone. The board was reviewing recent allegations and assessing leadership continuity in light of ongoing medical and legal developments. Translation: they were panicking. Julian Vanguard, who had been positioning himself as the inevitable successor, suddenly found himself under scrutiny. Board members who had quietly supported the conservatorship petition were now distancing themselves, claiming they had been misled about Elliot's condition. The carefully constructed plan was collapsing. And Julian knew it. He arrived at the hospital just after 6 o'clock, storming past the nurse's station and shoving open the door to Elliot's room. Naomi stood immediately, placing herself between Julian and his father's bed. Get out of my way, Julian snarled. You need to leave, Naomi said firmly. Now. This is my father, Julian spat. Not yours. You're a goddamn housekeeper who got lucky with a piece of paper. Naomi didn't move. I'm the person he trusted. And I'm the reason he's still alive. Julian's face twisted with rage. You've destroyed everything. The board is turning on me. The press is calling us vultures. You've made us look like monsters. I didn't make you anything, Naomi said quietly. I just showed people who you already were. Julian lunged forward, but a security guard appeared in the doorway, summoned by the nurse who had seen him storm in. Sir, you need to step back. Julian whirled on the guard. Do you know who I am? Yes, sir, the guard said calmly. And I know you're not allowed in this room without the patient's advocate's permission. Julian turned back to Naomi, his chest heaving. This isn't over. You think you've won? You've just painted a target on your back. We have resources you can't even imagine. Then use them, Naomi said. Take me to court. Sue me. Come at me with everything you have. But your father is not going to be erased while I'm still breathing. For a long moment, Julian just stared at her, his face contorted with fury and something else. Fear maybe. Or the realization that he had underestimated the wrong person. Finally he turned and walked out, shoving past the security guard. The door swung shut behind him. Naomi's legs nearly gave out. She sat down heavily, her hands shaking. The guard stepped inside. You okay, ma'am? Naomi nodded. Thank you. He nodded and left, closing the door quietly. Naomi sat in silence, listening to the machines, the soft hum of the ventilation system, the distant sounds of the hospital at night. Then she heard it. A sound so soft she almost missed it. A sob. Naomi's head snapped up. Elliot was crying. Silent tears streamed down his face, his expression crumpled with emotion. His left hand trembled, reaching toward her. Naomi moved to his side, taking his hand in both of hers. It's okay, she whispered. You're safe. I promise. Elliot's eyes locked on hers, and for the first time since the stroke, she saw him fully present. Not the powerful billionaire. Not the tech titan. Just a man broken and betrayed, struggling to find his way back. They tried to erase you, Naomi said softly. But you're still here. And we're going to make sure the world knows it. Elliot squeezed her hand, his tears falling faster now. Naomi reached for a tissue and gently wiped his face, the way she had done for her mother in those final months. You don't have to be strong right now, she said. You just have to keep fighting. Elliot's breathing steadied slowly. His tears slowed. But his hand never let go of hers. 2 days later, the court suspended the conservatorship petition pending further investigation. The district attorney's office opened a probe into potential elder abuse and financial fraud. 3 of the doctors who had signed the original evaluations were placed on administrative leave. And the board of Vanguard Systems voted to install an interim CEO, bypassing Julian entirely. The news broke on a Friday afternoon. Naomi read it on her phone while sitting in her usual chair beside Elliot's bed. She looked up at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. They're scared, she said. Good. Elliot blinked twice. Yes. His recovery was slow, agonizing, frustrating. He would never be the man he was before. But he was still here. Still fighting. Still proving that he was more than the sum of his wealth and power. And Naomi was still beside him. Same chair. Same quiet presence. But everything had changed. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't just the housekeeper, the cleaner, the woman who existed in the margins. She was the person who had refused to let a man be buried alive. And in that refusal, she had uncovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Outside the hospital window, the city lights flickered in the January darkness. Somewhere out there, Julian Vanguard was strategizing, Victoria was protecting her assets, and lawyers were preparing their next moves. But in this room, in the soft glow of medical monitors, Naomi Carter sat beside Elliot Vanguard and held his hand. And for the first time in a very long time, neither of them was alone. 6 months later, Elliot Vanguard sat in a wheelchair by the window of his rehabilitation facility, watching the late summer sun paint the Hudson River gold. His recovery had been slow. Painfully, frustratingly slow. Physical therapy sessions that left him exhausted and angry. Speech therapy that turned simple words into mountains to climb. Occupational therapy that forced him to relearn tasks a child could do without thinking. He would never walk without assistance again. His right arm remained weak, his fine motor control compromised. His speech had improved, but he still slurred when tired, still searched for words that used to come effortlessly. But he was alive. And he was present. And that Naomi had reminded him on his darkest days was enough. The criminal investigation had taken 4 months. In the end, no charges were filed. The prosecutors had called it aggressive estate planning and family conflict, stopping just short of provable fraud. Julian had hired the best defense attorneys money could buy, and they had done their job well. But the court of public opinion had been less forgiving. The business press had torn the Vanguard family apart, piece by piece. Investigative journalists had uncovered years of financial maneuvering, shell companies, and questionable board decisions. Julian's reputation was destroyed. Marcus had fled to Monaco permanently, avoiding subpoenas and reporters alike. And Victoria? Victoria had simply disappeared. No statements. No interviews. No apologies. She had moved to her estate in the Hamptons and stayed there, silent and unreachable. The divorce papers had arrived 3 weeks after the conservatorship petition was withdrawn. Elliot had signed them without hesitation. He had no family left. Not in any way that mattered. The people who should have loved him had tried to erase him. And the only person who had fought for him was a woman who had spent 9 years being invisible in his home. Mr. Vanguard? Naomi's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She stood in the doorway holding a folder. Your lawyer is here. Are you ready? Elliot nodded slowly. Ready. Naomi wheeled him to the small conference room the facility had set aside for legal meetings. David Park, Elliot's new attorney, a Korean-American man in his 40s with a reputation for integrity and a complete lack of tolerance for corporate games, stood when they entered. Elliot, he said warmly, shaking Elliot's left hand. Naomi. Thank you both for making time. What's the news? Naomi asked, sitting beside Elliot. David opened his briefcase and pulled out several documents. The new estate plan is finalized. We've filed it with the court, and it's now a matter of public record as you requested. Elliot had insisted on that. No more secret trusts, no more hidden amendments, no more documents that could be shredded or altered the moment he was vulnerable. Everything was transparent now. Everything was documented. The controlling shares of Vanguard Systems have been transferred to an independent trust, David continued. The board will operate without interference from you or your family. You retain voting rights on major decisions, but day-to-day control is with the interim CEO and the board majority. Elliot nodded. It had been a difficult decision, letting go of the company he had built from nothing. But he had come to understand something during his months of recovery. Power didn't protect you. It just gave you more to lose. David turned to another page. As for personal assets, you've established the Vanguard Care Advocacy Fund, which will support patient rights organizations, caregiver training programs, and legal assistance for families navigating medical decision-making. How much? Naomi asked quietly. $50 million, David said. Endowed in perpetuity. Naomi's breath caught. Elliot looked at her, his expression steady despite the effort it took to keep his face composed. People like you, he said slowly, each word deliberate, shouldn't have to fight alone. Naomi's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. David continued. And finally, there's the matter of Miss Carter's compensation. Naomi stiffened. We talked about this. I know, Elliot interrupted gently. But listen. David pulled out another document. Mr. Vanguard has established a separate fund to cover your mother's remaining medical debts, which I understand still exist. That debt will be cleared in full. Additionally, he's created a living trust that will provide you with an annual income for the rest of your life, indexed to inflation. Elliot, no, Naomi said firmly. That's not why I stayed. I know, Elliot said again. His left hand reached for hers. You stay because you're a good person. I'm doing this because I'm trying to be one. Naomi looked down at their joined hands, tears spilling over now despite her efforts to hold them back. I didn't do this for money. I did it because it was right. I know, Elliot said for the third time. That's exactly why you deserve it. David cleared his throat gently. The trust is irrevocable, Miss Carter. It's already established. The only question is whether you'll accept the annual distribution or allow it to accumulate for future use. Naomi wiped her eyes, frustrated and overwhelmed. How much? $75,000 per year, David said. Enough to live comfortably, pursue education if you choose, or support causes you believe in. It's not wealth. It's security. Naomi looked at Elliot, searching his face. Why? Elliot took a slow breath. Because you gave me my life back. And because you deserve to live yours without fear. For a long moment, Naomi couldn't speak. Finally she nodded. Okay. But only if the majority goes to the advocacy fund. I don't need $75,000. I need 20. The rest should help other people. David looked at Elliot, who smiled, the expression lopsided but genuine. She's tougher than my entire legal team, he said. David chuckled. I'll make the adjustments. He packed up his documents and stood. I'll leave you two to talk. Congratulations, Elliot. You've built something good here. After David left, Naomi and Elliot sat in silence for a while. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, warming the small room. Finally, Naomi spoke. Can I ask you something? Anything, Elliot said. Why did you sign that caregiver document? 8 months before the stroke. You weren't sick then. What made you think you'd need it? Elliot looked out the window, his expression distant. I knew, he said slowly. Not about the stroke, but about them. My family. I saw the way they looked at me. Like I was already a problem they were waiting to solve. He turned back to Naomi. You were the only person in my house who treated me like a human being. Not a bank account. Not an obstacle. Just a person. Naomi's throat tightened. I was your employee. You were kind, Elliot corrected. You asked how I was feeling. You made food I actually liked. You noticed when I was tired. He paused, struggling with the words. You saw me. And I knew if something happened, you'd be the only one who would care if I lived or died. Naomi reached over and squeezed his hand. I'm glad you trusted me. I'm glad you stayed, Elliot said. They sat together as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room. After a while, Naomi stood. I should let you rest. Where will you go? Elliot asked. Naomi smiled. I've been accepted into a nursing program at Hunter College. I start in the fall. Elliot's face lit up. You're going back. I never really left, Naomi said. I just got sidetracked for a while. But yeah. I'm going back. You'll be extraordinary, Elliot said. Naomi laughed softly. I'll be a student with a lot of catching up to do. But I'll work hard. You always do, Elliot said. Naomi walked to the door, then paused and turned back. For what it's worth, I don't think you were a bad person, Mr. Vanguard. I think you were a lonely one. And I think you built walls so high you forgot how to let people in. Elliot's eyes glistened. I'm trying to do better. I know, Naomi said gently. And you are. 3 weeks later, on a clear September morning, Naomi walked out of the rehabilitation facility for the last time as Elliot's primary caregiver. He had transitioned to a long-term care program with a full medical team. He didn't need her anymore. Not in the way he once had. But they had made plans. Weekly visits. Phone calls. Updates on her classes and his physical therapy progress. They had become something neither of them had expected. Friends. Naomi paused at the building entrance and looked back. 4 floors up, she could see Elliot's window. He sat there in his wheelchair, his left hand raised in a slow wave. She waved back, smiling. Then she turned and walked toward the subway station, her bag slung over her shoulder, the late summer sun warm on her face. Behind her, Elliot watched until she disappeared around the corner. Then he turned his wheelchair away from the window and looked around his small room. It wasn't the penthouse. It wasn't the empire he had built. But it was his. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't alone. Not because of money. Not because of power. But because one person had chosen to stay when everyone else walked away. And that choice had changed everything. Months later, a reporter from a business magazine reached out to Naomi for an interview. She almost declined. But then she thought about all the other women like her, working in the shadows, dismissed and underestimated, carrying strength no one bothered to see. So she agreed. The interview was published in October, alongside a photo of Naomi in her nursing student scrubs, standing outside Hunter College. The final paragraph read, when asked why she fought so hard for a man who wasn't family, who hadn't always treated her as an equal, Naomi Carter's answer was simple. Because when you strip away the money and the power and the titles, we're all just people. And people deserve dignity. Even when they're too weak to demand it themselves. The article went viral. Naomi received dozens of interview requests, speaking invitations, and messages from caregivers around the country who had faced similar battles. She turned down most of them. She had studying to do. But she kept one message. It was from a woman in Ohio whose elderly father was being pressured into signing over his estate by relatives he barely knew. I read your story, the woman wrote, and I realized I didn't have to be a lawyer to fight for him. I just had to care enough to try. Thank you for showing me that was enough. Naomi printed the message and pinned it to her dorm room wall. And every time she felt overwhelmed by coursework or exhausted from clinical rotations, she looked at it and remembered. Caring was enough. Staying was enough. Sometimes, the bravest thing you could do was refuse to walk away. And in a world that valued power and profit above all else, that quiet act of defiance could change everything. Years later, when Naomi Carter graduated with her nursing degree and began working in patient advocacy, people would ask her about Elliot Vanguard, about the billionaire she had saved, about the family she had exposed, about the fortune she had refused. And every time her answer was the same. I didn't save him because he was rich. I stayed because he was human. And that's the only reason that ever mattered. Elliot Vanguard lived for another 7 years. He never returned to Vanguard systems. He never reconciled with his family. But he spent those years funding programs, supporting caregivers, and writing letters to advocacy organizations in his slow, determined handwriting.